Good evening, everyone. My name is Shireen Rustam, and I'm the Assistant Director of Alumni Relations here at Fairfield, along with Tim Martin. Some of you have met him. We work with Mary Spiegel over in the Alumni House, and she couldn't be with us today. She's in Boston. For those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Simoes, I'm going to give you a couple of facts about where he's been and what he's done. Dr. Simoes got his bachelor's in education from Boston College and his master's and doctorate from Columbia. He was a professor of bilingual education at NYU most recently, and then he was a Fulbright scholar in Portugal at the University of Lisbon before joining us. He is an authority in bilingual education with an emphasis on Hispanic, Asian, and Portuguese language programs, as well as equity and excellence for minority students. Prior to NYU, he was associated with Rhode Island College, Boston University School of Education, and Hunter College's School of General Studies. His work at these institutions has involved ethnic diversity and cultural awareness. So I ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Simoes.
Thank you. Before I start, I'm a little nervous this evening, and it's interesting. It says preparing students for the 21st century. My daughter is in the Beth Israel Hospital waiting to have twins, and so it's kind of ironic that I'm speaking to something it's personally happening to me. So please forgive the kind of nervousness. I'll begin this conversation with several stories. All of these stories relate to change in technology, change in ethics, change in demographics, change in the way we think of economic systems and how our economic environment relates to our personal checkbook and to international politics. I will talk about change that is the very essence of who we are and what we can be. One story comes into mind is the following. My son and I share the love of music, and we are both musicians. I began to play the clarinet around the age of 7, and by the time I was 10, I was playing solo clarinet for a local band. I still remember standing on a box when I played my solo. It was a simple life. If I could be an accomplished clarinetist, I could play for the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Well, that was shortened by rock and roll. I picked up the saxophone, and the rest is history. At the age of 12, my son began to play the guitar. First, he played and studied classical music. But, as Toynbee suggested, history is cyclical. He also got the bug. It was called rock and roll. This is where our history's part. Several years ago, my son presented me with an audio tape that he recorded in his room. I knew that he bought some of the latest recording equipment, and he could record music with 8 tracks onto one master tape. This equipment gave him the opportunity to compose and record music. But the equipment went further. It gave him the opportunity to create different musical instruments, develop digital sounds, and even create his own percussions. One day he said to me, "Dad, would you like to hear this?" I was astonished. He had composed, recorded a complete song with a variety of instruments, just with his guitar. What a difference in our generation. When I grew up, there was the music sheet in my clarinet. I did not have the opportunity to have these kinds of support systems to understand and create music by using other musical instruments. Well, now I have caught up to the present. Today I have several synthesizers, a multi-track recording studio. It is fun and opens other doors to my own creativity. In short, with the assistance of technology, I can write the sheet music as I play and at the same time compose a song. When I reflect on this event, I know that children have options that my generation never had or even dreamed of. As educators and parents, we have to examine these new and exciting options and adapt our school curriculum for the 21st century. Our schools have to invest in new ways of thinking through technology. Our software, in quotes, can no longer be antiquated pedagogical assumptions where we argue over individual and group learning. reading, math scores, or parental involvement. As we know, many children will spend hours at a Nintendo game or will watch television and gain knowledge through this medium. In turn, many children will return into a classroom where most of our medium of instruction is accomplished the way our grandparents were educated. There is teacher talk and children's response, of the child's response. Some children are put in groups. Still, the medium instruction and the medium of communication is usually verbal. Be that as it is, the issue of technology as a pedagogical support system for children and teachers is very rarely found in our classroom. It is a different world, and we have to understand that technology is not part of the 21st century, but is a present factor in our lives. Another story is what I call technology, medicine, and the concept of ethics. In the past, for example, the view of death was a simple matter. When the heart stopped, one was dead. As we know, medical knowledge has grown several-fold. Now we have support systems to keep us alive. The idea of brain death has substituted the heartbeat. People with incurable and terminal diseases can be kept alive for a longer period of time by mechanical means. With these real fundamental differences about the definition of death and the definition of dying, the concept of ethics comes into play. Questions such as the following are presently real for many families. Where is the point where I can say to a physician to take away a life, or take away the life from a support system? Shall I give authorization to keep a loved one alive even if she has a terminal disease or is in constant pain? What are the ethical and moral dilemmas when one faces these decisions? Because of developments in the field of genetics, I am sure that our children will face ethical issues beyond our imagination. Through genetic engineering, a couple may select a child's hair, eye color, height, weight, and so on. As frightening as this may seem, it is a reality that we must understand. Excuse me. In this domain, my vision of the 21st century is still not clear. I know that many new ethical problems are explored by our theologians and legal scholars. Still, in our teaching training institutions, most universities do not carry one course in the ethics of teaching. Many trainers and teachers still believe that ethics in education are church-related issues and that ethics are relative. I believe that this assumption is incorrect. Ethical values are based in sociological and anthropological values of society based in tradition and law. It is true that traditions and the legal process may be based on certain values, but to make a clear distinction that the field of ethics is only a religious and parental responsibility is to continue to hide under the old argument of the division of church and state. As a social scientist, I know that there is no clear division. But by hiding and not dealing with this issue, we can see the results. Poverty is increasing, people are afraid to get old and lose most of their life savings. Many children are checked in school by metal detectors for lethal weapons. Children are now given permission to practice safe sex by the distribution of condoms. But they are not given information about the failure rate, they are not given classes on ethics and responsibilities of parenthood. The condom distribution gives only one message. If you are sexually active and you use a condom, your chances of getting AIDS are less. I will concede that some ethical issues are relative, and in a diverse society one must respect this condition. But to hide our heads in the sand and not to have college classes in ethics and education is not to cope with the new and somewhat frightening change in the society what we live. Permit me to give one more example. It is true the following may be somewhat, off course in relation to the major topic, but it does give some food for thought. I have suggested that the use of technology is an important factor for adults and who will be for adults in the 21st century. I have also suggested that this phenomena is a present-day reality and our schools are still practicing antiquated pedagogy. I have not dealt with the use of technology from the point of view of how it is distributed in the classroom. Some of the educational literature suggests that we treat children and the kinds of pedagogical questions we ask depends on the social, racial, and ethnic group. What the literature implies is that we distribute knowledge in different ways depending on the social class of the child. In other words, cultural capital is a meaningful pedagogical device to maintain certain social, racial lines in society at large. Be that as it may, this evening I do not wish to dwell on this topic. Still, I think it's essential to explore with new perspective teaches ethical situations when computers are used for skill development and remediation in one social class, and at the same time support educational activities in another social class. Why is the distribution of knowledge different, and what are the ethical consequences? Let me break from the text here for a minute and give you an example. The use of computers in a classroom, in general, if one goes to an urban situation, they'll be used for what we call remediation, for skill development, and so forth. And if we go into what is called a middle-class situation, the use of computers comes to support children to write textbooks, term papers, and just the use of technology from that point of view brings on a lot of what I call ethical questions. Ethical questions such as, why are we doing this? Are we really giving, quote, a head start to the so-called poor child? Maybe not. The use of testing is also a very interesting concept in terms of ethical situations. Once we use the concept of paradigm of testing, we develop a curve. Once we develop the curve, we develop social lines. Once we develop social lines, we develop racial lines and ethnic lines. And when we see these kinds of things, it's very good for a statistician and even for a principal or superintendent of a school to understand what is happening. But the ethical situation is, how do we pedagogically equal that curve so all the children have an equal education? And I don't have an answer for that, but the literature, the so-called literature in critical thinking, suggesting that by doing these kinds of things, the ethical situation becomes is that we become very unethical by showing divisions. Let me continue with another story and then touch on other areas that I see as important factors in educating children to cope with the present and future. As our local and national recession continues, our quality of life declines and our purchasing power becomes less and less. We begin to understand the term global economy. Today, the relationship between management and labor is not on a local basis. When I grew up, people worked for a local company. Even the automobile industry in Detroit was local because the owners on the board of trustees were directly tied to the American economy. I still remember that things, quote, made in Japan were considered inferior. American products were the best. Made in USA was considered to be good. Somewhere in my not too long distant past, I started to realize the term obsolescence was part of a manufacturing strategy to keep the economy on a steady pace and at the same time to maintain productivity and jobs. What I did not realize was that this strategy would backfire and that many Americans would turn to quality. What was ironic was that some of the better quality items were even less expensive than our domestic products. Taking all these factors into account, years ago I would never have thought that the United States would have a troubled economy in the sense that other countries would have a higher standard of living. Before I get to a story, as you probably heard yesterday, General Motors is closing 21 plants and the elimination of 74,000 jobs. Just think of that. And these are before, again, when we grew up, most of us, when there would be layoffs. The kinds of things that would happen was that people would know to be called back. These are terminal layoffs. In other words, terminal unemployment or terminal unemployment. The thing is, in our school system, we have to understand that when we say service economy, as I'm starting to see the way our economy is working in the 1990s, is that we have to think of service and the managerial class, the so-called productive class, as we know it today, as I understand it, and it may change, hopefully it will, is becoming less and less. So I'm not sure how we're going to train or educate children from that point of view. Is how do we, again, distribute knowledge? How do we create curriculum? How do we create schools to develop managers, people who will not be in the service area? As we know, the service area in terms of minorities is getting larger and larger, and as we know, the income is getting between one class and the other class is getting also larger and larger. Now to my last story. The other day, my sister and I were on a TWA flight from Lisbon to New York. What I found somewhat strange was that most of the passengers were Portuguese and they were dressed in expensive clothing. They had Nikon and Sony video cameras. I was curious because in the past, most of the flights from Lisbon to the United States either had American tourists or Portuguese immigrants, some of the immigrants coming for the first time, while others returning to the United States from a vacation in Portugal. Due to my curiosity, I struck up a conversation with one of the passengers. I found out that it was a group tour of bank tellers taking their families to Disney World. My sister and I struck up a conversation about the past, present, especially about my father, who was always helping the newcomer, arranging housing, employment, and the like for the new immigrant. My sister turned to me and said, "I wish Dad were alive. He would never dream that Portuguese would come to the United States for a vacation and could afford to spend money here. Now, for us, it's getting too expensive to travel to Europe." Things have really changed. Her statement made me reflect on the past, present, and future about social and economic change. In the past, we basically had an extended family system. People took care of each other. The term catastrophic insurance was not even in our vocabulary. In my generation, I heard of the nuclear family, a change that happened during the Industrial Revolution. In this case, there was still stability. Schools still talked about the 3 R's. Now we have sociologists talking about in the industrial family, and many parents are single, which they have latchkey children. In other words, even the concept of family has changed in terms of our economics. It's interesting, again, as a father, having 2 children, and one child, my daughter who's married, when I see how they struggle economically, and I think back 30 years ago, when I was her age, 30 or 40 years ago, it wasn't that difficult. But I also think of schooling, the relationship between schooling and society. I believe, and I'd like to go back in time to see if this is correct, the school curriculum that I had and we had more or less matched with the skills that society demanded. I don't see that happening today. And I see, as we change sociologically, I don't think our schools are handling this. One comment before I get out of the text here. The other thing I'm starting to understand is what I call knowledge curriculum and social curriculum. As I've traveled through Europe and Asia, I see basically that the curriculum, the schooling itself, has never left what they call knowledge-based curriculum. Students are generally expected to have a amount of knowledge. Some societies even say if you fail a year, and there's no such thing as failure. In other words, if you do not pass, which is not failing, a year you'll stay for another grade. We have attempted in the last 20 or 30 years what I call a social curriculum, and I still believe that is important. But I'm not sure where the line is drawn between a social curriculum and a knowledge curriculum where children start competing again. And as we see our SAT and our GRE scores going down and down, I think partly is that, although our statistics are more sophisticated, so we could argue the other way. Of course, our schools are part of our society, and they must respond to changes that many educators are still not prepared to cope with. It is a very complex and somewhat troubled world. So what does the 21st century mean for us? Let me suggest that the 21st century issues are immediate day problems, and we cannot hide from the present. To hide from profound change is to give credence to values that are no longer applicable in today's situation. As the Dean of the Graduate School of Education and Allied Professions, I believe that I have the responsibility to examine some of the fundamental concerns in teacher training, ethics, and the economy that will affect our present and future generations. We have passed Orwell's 1984 and implemented many of his suppositions. Just reflect for a moment. In 9 years, we will reach the year 2001. Just think, some children born, even maybe my grandchildren now, some children born in the next few years may see the entrance of the 22nd century. Of course, I'm not a fortune teller, and I cannot predict the future, and that is why my thesis is based on the present-day realities, or present realities. The future is the present, and we cannot hide from this actuality. There are a few things that the literature suggests, and we can use this data to understand the present and the future. They are, 1, the United States has shifted to a service economy. It is my understanding that this type of economy, the difference in earning power between the managerial and the working class increases. Upward mobility is limited for those who have the cultural capital to enter the managerial class. This issue presents many problems in our schools and curriculum change. Even the fundamental emphasis on the so-called 3 R's may have to be revised. As suggested, the use of technology, problem solving, the interpretation of ethical questions comes into play into our curriculum. 2. I have not discussed the issue in detail, but demographics in the United States is shifting from a majority of a European population to a majority of a non-European population. Assuming this change continues to take place, it is estimated that around the year 2010 or the year 2020, the United States will have a majority of non-Europeans. Some statistics are an audit from the state of Connecticut, our home here. This data is taken from the Minority Student Staff Report, State of Connecticut, Board of Education, 1991. And I'll go through several statistics here, which I think you'll find very interesting. A. In October 1990, minority students totaled 25.1% of 117,155 of the 466,000 public school students in the state of Connecticut. This percent age continued to climb. Minority students were 24.4% of the total in 1989, 21.7% in 1985, 18.0% in 1980, and 14.7% in 1975. B. From 1989 to 1990, the number of minority students increased by 4.4%, or 4,910 white total public schools enrollment, while total public schools enrollment increased by 1.6%, or 7,449. C. From 1980 to 1990, there was a decline of 13.7% in the total enrollment and an increase of 20.2% in minority enrollment. So you see, as a so-called majority enrollment, or basically white enrollment, decreases, the minority enrollment keeps increasing. The number of Hispanic students continues to grow more rapidly than other groups, up 2,598 from 1989 to a total of 46,954. The number of black students increased by 1,443 to 59,104. This is the largest increase in over 20 years. E. Minorities represented at least 1 of every 4 students in kindergarten through grade 7, more than 1 of 4 in grade 9, but less than 1 in 5 in grade 12. So as you can see, the younger we see schooling, the more minority participation we have. In 16 Connecticut school districts, minority students amounted to more than 1/4 of the total enrollment. This was the same number of districts such as in 1989. G, although minority enrollment was 25.1% statewide, 97 of 166 districts had a minority enrollment of less than 5%. 26 districts had a minority enrollment of more than 10% and enrolled 86% of the minority students. Just to comment on that, again, off the text here. If one looks at the demographics in sociology, I think it's somewhat frightening. The Brown versus Topeka decision in 1954 hasn't really been put in place in the sense of equal education. As we're starting to see, is urban education is becoming more of color, and suburban education is becoming a mix, and then private education, which is both urban and suburban, is becoming basically lily white, which is very, very interesting. And we're starting to see the statistics in the last 10 years, this is increasing more and more. And there's a contradiction in this, too, and I don't know, this is off the text, but we'll talk about it. And I feel very, very sad what's happening at UB. The contradiction of many schools, such as UB, who've made somewhat a contribution to the community, who've made given a lot of financial aid. And again, anybody here know about budgets in terms of what we call paper money, real money? It becomes paper money when it comes to faculty salaries, maintenance of buildings, and so forth. We see the demise of UB, and it's sad. It really is. And this is something we have to also look at in the future, is the relationship between state, federal, local, and private enterprise in supporting private and public education. And the census, too, if you look, if you, as I continue with these figures, the minority population is increasing. Well, someday it's no longer minority. I think that the term should be disappearing soon. And as we've seen the manager class and the so-called service class, this is also separating. And it's I think, somewhat frightening. In Connecticut's 5 largest cities, 7.3% of all students were members of a minority group, up from 76.76% in 1989. But listen to this. The Hartford Public School District served the largest number and proportion of minority students, 23,414 students, or 92.1% of its total enrollment. In other words, if one goes to Hartford, 92% of the students at Hartford are minority. New York City is basically in the 80s and 90s. It's the New Haven, I'm not sure. I don't think I have the statistics of New Haven, but I'm sure it's up there. Almost 70% of white students attended schools with less than 10% minority enrollment, while almost 34% of minority students attended schools more than 90% of minority enrollment. There were 13 local public schools, 1.3% of the total schools, technically out of compliance. In other words, the whole compliance issue, which people are not paying attention to much after the Carter administration, is, I think, a very serious issue, too, is that literally, with all the politics involved here, there are many, many school districts who are not in compliance in terms of just equal opportunity. On September 1st, 1990, there were 39,085 full-time professional staff members in Connecticut Public Schools, a decrease of 0.6% from the year before. This decrease in full-time staff followed a drop of 5% from 1988 to 1989. Finally, of the total full-time professional staff members in the state, 2,453, or 6.3%, were minorities, the same percentage as the 2 previous years. So we have, on one level, more or less 6.3% of minorities as staff, and we see the increase in minorities the other way. Now, I am not implying at all that one has to be a minority to teach minorities. That is not the issue here. I think all of us can be good teachers. The issue here is in terms of equal opportunity, equal access, distribution, curriculum, all the other fundamental issues that's happening in our society. Thus, this present conflict of the Eurocentric curriculum versus the issues of diversity are real in our present situation. And if our demographic data are correct, the educational establishment must address diversity in a profound manner to ensure that students are knowledgeable about the world. Let me just give you another example I find interesting coming out of bilingual education, which, again, is not the topic of this evening. But being in the field called bilingual ed for 20-some-odd years, I really learned a lot in terms of diversity. And when I was at NYU, we had a campus in Sagrado Corazon, Sacred Heart University in Puerto Rico. And it was interesting, living in the Caribbean off and on, one thing I noticed is what we call in Europe the discoveries, is that we have history, the European history, which is called Descubrimiento de Discoveries, which what happens here is that Europeans really believed in the textbooks and in our textbooks, the age of discovery is that went to the Caribbean, to South America, to Africa, and so forth to discover. And of course, if I go to, if I go to Puerto Rico and I say discoveries, I really basically get a remark. I wasn't discovered, I was already here. And basically, the discoverers were really the conquistadores, or the conquerors, who basically brought in sickness, wiped out the Taínos, and so forth. I'm not legitimating one or the other. I'm just saying that it's interesting in terms of Eurocentric versus non-Eurocentric that there are other ways to look at the world. And what I find, too, and again, this is kind of a generalization, but living in Europe, I find many students, European students, a lot more knowledgeable about world geography, world situations than our students. So when we argue the concept of Eurocentric, it goes further than Eurocentric. It goes basically to knowledge-centric, if you will, to have knowledge about the world. And as we know, the global economy is happening, and I think that is important. I want to emphasize that this issue is not a future problem, but is happening under our very existence, and we must ensure that equal education is given to all the population. As implied, as technology changes, our lives As technology changes our lives, new social paradigms are formed. These paradigms create new problems, questions, and of course, new solutions. In short, I guess the major question is the following. How do we prepare teachers to teach children of the 21st century? The answer is not simple. I have only talked about a few fundamental problems confronting our school systems. I do know that teachers must be knowledgeable about the new world, both in the present and the future, in the areas of technology, in the educational research literature, in contextual pedagogy, child development, world economy, ethics, cultural diversity, and so on. This, of course, is almost an impossible task. Let me finish with a lighter and fictional story of the future. The other day, a group of friends were discussing the demise of the Soviet Union and how the Soviet republics were demanding independence. Our discussion came back to the American history and the Civil War, a war not too distant in our past. As we compared both historic events, we probed into the future. Could it be possible that 200 or 300 years from now, the United States of America will no longer be the United States? Maybe Connecticut would have a national tax revolt and claim independence from the federal government. The future writers and historians would have a heyday and write the books of the rise and fall of the United States and the influence of Connecticut politics in 1991. Although this is beyond my comprehension and quite silly, the point is what we do today could have never been dreamed of just 25 years ago. Time will reveal these probing and exciting questions. My contention is that the children of today are not being prepared for the present, and of course, they will be the adults of the 21st century. We must reflect on these serious issues, and if we are to survive as a nation, as a people, we have to look at the situation seriously. We have no other choice. Thank you. If there are any questions, now this is the conversation. This is supposed to be a conversation, so I just prepared this to, now I'm a lot more, less nervous. Any questions, comments? We would like to have a dialogue, please.
I'm going to jump on the very last thing that
Sure.
you said, children not being prepared. When you say children, are you referring to children who are high school children or children who are elementary children? You repeated a few times that there's a different knowledge base between here and Europe. And so are we talking about children who read a great deal in other countries, which they do not do here, starting at a very young age? I'm an elementary teacher.
That's a good question. I really, let me just respond. I don't know, but let me try to let's reflect on that. We know that the dropout rate is happening in middle school. It's around the 8th or 9th grade. That's when children start dropping out. That means something is happening, I think, in elementary schools. In terms of technology, it really depends. I've seen some excellent programs. I mean, when I talk about children not being prepared, in most instances, if I go to a good private school, even in New York City, I will see excellent technology. Teachers are motivated. Many suburban schools the same. I'm sure that Fairfield has many good schools. I'm worried more about the urban schools is what's happening in the urban education. As the statistics are showing, the data, the demographics showing, is that we are increasing to a non-European population. The other part is technology. How many here are teachers? How many? What kind of? See, what I'm doing here, I'm contradicting exactly what I said. I'm using the old text. Instead of having slides, I could have videoed this. I could have had really do a neat job here that I could sit down and we could have done it, and you probably would have enjoyed it more, and I probably would have been less nervous and just be there. So this way, you see what I'm doing? I'm doing a contradiction here. I'm doing the old way. I'm speaking to you, and you're responding. Now, this is so antiquated in terms of technology. If I were a board of directors or at Citibank or someone would say to me, the president of the corporation say, okay, you're one of the administrators, I want you to give a top job in speaking. I would never do it this way. I'll probably even get fired. But this is the way we teach. This is the kinds of things. And I'm not saying we just don't know how to do it yet. In our schools of education, in general, we're not meeting technology. So, other questions, comments, please. Yes.
I guess my question is not so much about technology, but my major concern is, are we producing leaders? Are we creating sheep or are we creating shepherds? And I guess one of my great concerns about our educational system is that perhaps we are creating people that ingest material, sort of give it back, but perhaps we're not enabling persons to think individually. My generation, I mean, I talk to my older colleagues. I'm a psychologist. My older colleagues, Clark Moustafis, who used to socialize with Fritz Perls, Ida Rolf, and many, many great leaders in a generation that's almost ready to die. And I'm wondering if when I'm 72 years old, as Clark is, am I going to be able to talk the same way about my colleagues that are my age? And I'm concerned. We haven't had a president that's been a leader in a long time. And I'm wondering if that is not part of our educational system, that we're producing followers.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. The literature in the education administration is changing. They're talking about leadership instead of management. In the 60s and 70s, we talked about managers. We always wanted to quote a good manager. And I think that presidents and universities all the way down to superintendents, they're just managers. It's terrible. But there are many managers out there. Leaders, I think, take risks, whatever that is. We're not taking risks. We're afraid to take risks, including us truly sometimes. It's frightening, not always afraid of the institution, to protect the institution. I don't know. Being on a college campus since the 1960s, I really miss the 60s, and from that point of view, is that the students questioned the establishment. I was, at that time, a student. I don't see students today questioning the establishment. I don't, for example, in my field, bilingual ed, again, just as an example. In the field of bilingual education, we pushed for, in Massachusetts, for different laws. We went to the courts. We used the court system to change ideas and so forth. If the ideas were incorrect or not, it's not for today, just in terms of leadership. I don't see that happening today. I don't see the kinds of testing in the courts. Maybe because the court is conservative, people are afraid. I don't know. The other part is, this is a projection on my part now. I think partly maybe we've lost our soul in education, our soul in the economy. I don't see many teachers who have been in the system more than 10 years already involved with children. A lot of young teachers are, and I'm glad to see that. Superintendents, for example, if we have some I really believe superintendents should have tenure. Superintendents, go back to the old system of tenure. Give the superintendent 5 to 8 years to say, okay, I want to see if you're good. But if you're good after 8 years, you're going to get tenure. Well, what happens to superintendents? Every 3 years or 4 years, they're changing jobs. Someone wants to develop a program, by the 4th or 5th year, he or she is gone. I don't know. In terms of leadership, I don't know. It's what's happening in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union is fascinating, because there are some leaders there, but it's a whole different circumstance, whole sociological, anthropological ways of looking at the world. I wish I could answer that. I'm not answering. I know I'm rambling, but I have no answer for that. They're leaders we don't have today. I guess that's the answer. Yes.
You briefly addressed the question of violence, and something that's struck me lately in the children I've been working with, the degree of violence, how it's grown with inner city kids, and they just don't feel safe in the schools. I was consulting at one school in which kids were actually trained, kindergarten kids, to lie down when bullets were fired in this particular city. I'm working with a group of adjudicated youth, and they all have guns. More than 50% of the kids have lost a first-degree relative to violent death. And on the average now, they're 5 years behind academically. I was wondering about your thoughts as societies become more and more violent.
I have all the academic answers for that. Personally, I really don't know how to respond to that. It's frightening. I cannot respond to the issue of violence in the sense where being a child, as we all were at one time, being safe to go play baseball or soccer, to be safe to even to go outside without worrying about getting mugged. There were no drugs when I grew up. There was beer, kids drank beer, but drugs in terms of violent drugs, drugs that are addictive. There's no such thing as the crack generation. Babies, the second generation, crack generation, the second generation now, not even for a second. We're entering mothers having children who are already on crack. So we're entering the second generation. And if you ever want to really get depressed, go to some of these hospitals in New York City, or I guess here in Bridgeport too, and seeing this kind of condition. I don't know. I can't answer that. I can give you a nice academic pat in terms of money in the schools, more teacher involvement, motivation, and it's all nice and neat and so forth. But on a personal level, I wish I had an answer for that. I'm quite concerned, frightened about this issue because it goes further. Let me give you an answer that's very personal. The idea of taking care of each other, the value of having a life, a fruitful life, and knowing at the end of your life or our lives that we will be comfortable economically. Doesn't happen anymore. We know that's not going to happen. We talk about catastrophic insurance. A child growing up in this world, unseeing these kinds of things, how does a child respond? I don't. That's it's very, very complex, and I'd like you to respond to that because, again, is in terms of a conversation, it's not really. How would you please?
One of the things I've been involved in a little bit with is some drug education work and some other things with adjudicated youth, and I'm just not convinced it works. I follow the curriculum and do these kind of things, sit down with these kids, try and present them with situations to at least develop some value system, some identification of their own values. I sit down with these kids and say, I'm bomb's going to go off and you have a shelter and you're these kinds of people. Who would you save? Why would you save? You get them kind of thinking. And the state in difficult times still spends a lot of money on these kids. They're very, very expensive. Connecticut spends about $90 million on the placement of children a year in residential treatment centers and other situations. And so I know we're doing lots of things. My kids come home, from suburban schools and say you can't talk to strangers, AIDS kills, and all these things. I just don't know that it's really having certainly raised anxiety in me. But I don't know that it's changed anything behaviorally. And so I guess on a basic level, as people involved in education, we think a lot about curricula and curricular development. And I just don't know that it's having the greater impact on this violence issue. And I think that one of the things that are going to happen, something at the level of in-home services in which we don't take kids out of violent situations, send them away somewhere and send them back, but in fact try to have some direct impact on the family.
Yeah, I don't know.
By setting in some remediation, rehabilitative element right in there. That's a thought for people trying to do that now. But I think all we've had, and there's a lot of educators here, all we've had are curriculum for people, kids to talk about. I don't know that that's going to have much of an influence. I mean, I think it's better than nothing. I talked with very serious juvenile offenders about safe-sex, and they laugh about, I don't know, consciousness raising on that is helpful or not. The other people might not.
Just that doesn't have directly to do with violence, it has to do, I guess, with environment. During the Gulf War, I was living in Europe. And it was interesting, I came for the interview for the deanship here at Fairfield just during the Gulf War, and I didn't realize what was happening in the United States, although we saw CNN's Global Village is very interesting. CNN was all over the world. There was the satellite dishes all over the place, and every day I would turn on the CNN to watch in the evening what was happening in the Gulf War. But basically in Europe, the Europeans were discussing nuclear fallout. They were scared stiff of nuclear fallout. That was the bottom line. What is going to happen here if the Iraqis really start hitting Israel with nuclear bombs or with gas? There's going to be a nuclear holocaust in Europe. And it was interesting coming back to the United States, and this issue was never even mentioned, but not violence, but the patriotism in the sense of not looking at the humane issues, but the patriotic issues, which are okay. I'm not saying they're wrong or right. I was just saying in terms of these issues. The other thing in terms of violence is I remember, again, this is something my own generation, when someone's down, you never hit the person until the person's up. And that today is, you make sure the person's down, then you make sure that person, it's a whole different attitude. I don't know. I wish I could respond to that. Again, I have all these neat answers as an academic, but looking at our society and, see, I think violence is not having enough money for a school system. I see that as violence. I see also violence of not taking care of the elderly, the poverty, the poor on the streets. That's violence too. So that's maybe part of the system. Solutions, again, I don't have any. I wish we all had solutions. Any comments, questions? So this is not negative, by the way. It seems like it's a negative speech. It really isn't. Let me just say this. When I see the curriculum at Fairfield as a dean, for example, nobody's talked about ethics here. Interesting. I'd like to explore ethics with everybody. The concept of ethics, as I see it, is basically what is good teaching? What is the value of the child? When we talk, for example, we talk about race. Let's look at it as an ethical situation. Forget race itself in terms of African American, Hispanic, and so forth. But once we create the concept of race as an issue, there are also ethics that belong in teaching. How we treat children, how we talk about children, how we create tests. Are they culture fair, not culture fair? Are they community-based, not community-based? These all become ethical issues. And we very rarely talk about issues of race and gender. You know, what are the ethical issues in gender? Just by separating male and female biologically in a classroom brings gender issues. What are the ethics in terms of this? Again, just getting back to so-called safe sex. But the bottom line is that the last figure I heard is 27% of condoms are failures in terms of failure rate. Think of that. Now, if we have 100 people in this room, and I say to 100 people here, more or less, that we're going to go up in an airplane and the plane's going to crash and 27 of us are going to die. You'd never get on an airplane. And we're saying to children, hey, it's okay if you practice safe sex, without having the ethical situation involved here. And I'm talking about theology, I'm not talking about religious ethics here, if you will. Just the ethical issue itself that say to the child, you're just by a child or adult or young adult, just by having, quote, safe sex, and if you use these kinds of methods, your chance of getting AIDS also is about, well, not 27%, but it's there. And we don't deal with that. And as I said here, I implied in my conversation, is that we see the separation of church and state, I believe that should be. But there's a line, the sociological line, is where do we jump or get on the fence and say, no, wait a minute, these are issues that are not really church related, but they're ethically related in terms of morality or in terms of ethics. And that's a tough one. That's a tough one because there are lots of laws in a diverse population to protect everybody, and they should be there. And it's a very, very difficult one. I remember, for example, smoking. This is a smoke-free room. Years ago, I think of this and I think it's crazy in terms of ethics, okay? Years ago, I used to be a smoker. Years ago, I used to teach smoking all the time. Years ago, I used to have a cigarette in my hand all the time, and I used to put it on the floor and put it out. Remember those days where teachers used to have... think if I ever did that now, in terms of ethics. There's no way. So in terms of these kinds of things, in terms of children, and in terms of adults, we're not dealing with them at all. We're not talking, just conversing. say, okay, what are these things? And it's not, so anybody have any comments on that? Because I think that's one thing that's so important that we don't touch upon. Nope. So we're all ethical in our society, I think, yeah. Yes?
I think the important message you probably provide is that maybe there are many more needed questions than solutions. Like Larry here has ongoing first-hand information about the pain and suffering of what he sees, and the solutions that are tried for children who are developing a culture to survive. And maybe the questions that are not being answered are really the crucial issues at hand. That they're not the questions that are needed for the culture that's being developed here, rather than the solutions that are always tried. The solutions that are tried to remediate the situation of violence is really not the issue, because there are many different cultures. You yourself raised 3 different cultures: the private school culture, the public school culture, the urban culture. Are those 3 cultures equatable in terms of the solutions that we provide? Maybe we're not really asking the right questions. Maybe this is a good forum to ask the question before we start delivering the solution. The same question goes for we're not developing leaders. I don't think that's true. I think there are many leaders. However, the nature of media changes how we look at leaders. And maybe there's a new question that we need to ask in terms of what constitutes a leader in what particular area, under what particular condition. So that I think the questions that we ask really provide us with a direction. The same thing probably goes for ethics. You know, I guess the word ethics means doing good. You know, in the field of counseling, the ethics of professionalism, marriage and family therapy, education, in terms of goodness of fit, in terms of providing the best service for the population that you serve. And then there are professional standards that go along with ethics. I think ethics change, just like the cigarette issue. You know, ethics change based on the social mores of the group. So in education, we have not moved fast enough for the work as fast as the world has moved. Perfect example: in Russia, we have a revolution going on. At one time under communism, for example, the generations were closer. Children admired their elders because the elders and children provided the sacraments for one another. Now, there's juvenile delinquency in Russia. The young children can't stand their elders. They're blaming their elders for the sins of the past. You know, and that's violence. That's violence in generation. That's violence to the community. So I think we're probably in a revolution we don't know about. And that I think we really are not asking the right questions. And we're trying old solutions. And I think that's a fundamental issue, and I think you raised it very well. And maybe that's our charge, you know, because we do have good thinkers, you know, and the questions that are raised to you are very good questions. And, you know, I'm not surprised that, you know, and I'm very pleased that you answered them honestly and said, I don't know that answer. You know, I mean, my God, could you imagine if you did? You'd be really a great sufferer.
You know, it's just, you know, it's interesting. In terms of the lighter note here, I just heard the other day, I just couldn't believe it, there's a custody suit going on in the court, I think it's in Arkansas, over sperm. I mean, literally, the couple's fighting they get divorced, and they're fighting over who has the custody over the sperm that was frozen. And it's amazing. I mean, who would think of this 5 years ago? Not even just 1991. It's amazing in terms of the questions. Yeah, I think you're right. I think there are new questions coming on, and as I mentioned here, imply the concept of death. As I said, you remember, look at old movies. You put the heart, you're dead. That's it. Not today. The concept of staying alive, not even the concept of staying alive ethically and so forth. Yeah, I wish I had some of those answers, but let me just give an example in terms of field special education. Special education is an interesting field in terms of ethics and so forth. We know that many, many children are in classes called special education, but most of the children in urban areas and across the country either Hispanic or African American. And the percentages are there. Riverside study in California is one of the famous studies that showed that how children would be classified if one were Hispanic, one would become learning disabled, for African American, emotionally disturbed, and all these categories and so forth. I was part of a team at NYU conducting some research on placement of children in special ed classes. And I'm not sure how it is in Connecticut, in New York State, and Massachusetts too, is a teacher refers a child for special ed. So the concept is the teacher has this tremendous power of reference, or referral, if you will. And what happens in this referral is it goes to a group of psychologists, special ed educators, and so forth, and the team will legitimate the referral. Well, lo and behold, 92% of the referrals, the kids stay in special ed. So just imagine the power of the teacher, just in terms of that. But the interesting part was, and the data's not all in yet, I was just talking to a friend of mine the other day on this, is that what we did is we took a group of children who were referred in special ed, who were special ed kids, and we gave profiles to the team, and they said, yes, yes, they belong in special ed. Then we took a group of, quote, normal kids, okay, and I put that in quotes, of course, gave the data to the referral team, said these kids should be in special ed. 87% said, yes, they belong in special ed. So the concept of referral itself becomes a power instrument here. Now, in terms of ethics, again, it's not special ed. I'm not after special ed, or I'm just in terms of concept. No, what ethical situations, when we get into race here, specifically race and ethnicity, I mean, there are tremendous ethical situations as a teacher to refer African American and Hispanic kids or children to special education, and how you distribute that. And my colleagues here in special ed can help me more in terms of how you get out. It's almost going to jail, a monopoly. Go to jail, and you do not pass go. Most of these kids go to jail, if you will, special ed, and never get out and label all their lives. And it depends how you classify. Now, in terms of ethics, I think that's a situation that people should discuss ethically. What does this mean? Especially if you have more children in one class and another not going into these classes. Any other comments? Okay, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.